Ready to begin? Okay.
Welcoming everyone in.
All right. So hello to everyone and good evening to those joining in the US and good morning to those joining from Japan. We wish you safety and health during this uncertain time around the world. Our hope is that this program will inform you about Japanese business amidst the challenges of COVID-19 while also providing a sense of normalcy. My name is Paul Pass, and I'm the Executive Director of the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary in 2020, and if anyone wishes to share this event on social media, please use hashtag JASDFW50. Before we begin, I would like to thank Deborah Harlow for her assistance on program logistics and compiling audience questions. If you would like to ask a question during the program, please use the chat function on the bottom of your screen. And please note that this could appear on the side of your screen depending on how you are viewing the webinar. If you are unable to utilize the chat function, you can select raise hand and your microphone will be unmuted. Speaker this evening, or this morning for those in Japan, is Dominic Carter, who is President and CEO of the Carter Group Japan Market Resource Network. He is highly experienced in cultural adaptation, as well as brand and communication strategy, and has led a wide range of qualitative and quantitative projects covering customer needs, segmentation, and digital strategy. He has worked in the market research industry in Australia, Japan, and the Asian region for over 20 years. Now to give some brief remarks is Peter Kelly, who has been president of the National Association of Japan America Societies since 2009. After his remarks, Dominic Carter will begin his presentation.
Thank you, Paul. This is Peter Kelly, and congratulations to the Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth on its 50th anniversary. 50 years is a long time to have a successful not-for-profit organization, and we send our congratulations. There are 38 Japan America Societies all around the United States. I'm with the National Association of Japan America Societies in Washington, D.C., and we provide program opportunities, Japan-related program opportunities to our members. All of our members at this point are shut down, unable to do the kind of events that they normally do. And we're very pleased that a number of our societies, including Dallas-Fort Worth, have chosen to embark on online content. It's all new to us, but we're very pleased to take the first steps down this path. Tonight's presentation is by Dominic Khanna, who earlier in this series called The Changing Consumer gave a presentation at the Japan America Society of Nevada, and will later on give presentations at with the Japan America Society of Georgia and of Southern California. In each of those presentations, Dominic discusses Japan's changing consumer in the age of Reiwa and COVID-19. We all learned about Reiwa last year for the first time, and we're all learning about COVID-19 for the first time this year. I predict that COVID-19 will be the word of the year for 2020, unfortunately. But the notion of content around Japan's changing consumer attitudes is a very important one, and we look forward to Dominic's presentation. Dominic?
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, well, first and foremost, I hope that everybody is keeping safe at the moment. This is the most important thing, and that you're adjusting to this situation, especially mentally, very well as we go into this kind of new normal. We're facing a somewhat uncertain situation, and although our crisis in Japan is not as severe as some parts of the US, we did actually enter our crisis earlier in Japan than the US, I think it's safe to say. Since 2017, we've been taking a measure of consumer sentiment in Japan. So we have four waves of this study now. We've always had questions about the image of the US in this study. That's the US in general, US brands, and last but not least, President Trump. The timing of our survey coincided with the crisis, So we took the opportunity to add relevant questions this year. So we're going to look at some long-term trends in this presentation in Japan, and also some short-term feedback in terms of what's going on right now. So by way of an agenda, I'm going to start by taking you through basically the design of our survey that we do every year, and give you some background on that. Then I'm going to talk about what have been some long-term trends that we've been seeing play out through the Reiwa period. Then I'll look at what a direct corona crisis impacts and maybe a medium-term outlook. Again, very uncertain situation, but we did ask people who cooperated with our survey to think further forward in terms of what they were likely to do, let's say a year from now. We're going to look at some measures on brand USA, and also I'm going to go into some big picture opportunities for US businesses, and certainly hoping that there are some Texas businesses here for whom that will be relevant. In 2017, we started polling Japanese every year in spring. At that time, the new Trump administration was quite new, and we thought it would be quite interesting, you know, apart from just getting a consumer sentiment measure every year, to look at what the way that the US is perceived, and if there is some impact that the new administration was having on that, because most of our clients are US businesses. This year we did the survey in March, 13th to 18th of March. So it's getting on to about a month ago now. But we do that survey each year in spring. So 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, we've done a very similar survey. The methodology is a web survey, self-completion, of course, and we have 1,000 samples nationwide, which is a good representative sample for us. The age in the sample is a population representative spread of 15 to 69-year-olds, and of course males and females, again population representative. So the data itself that's being presented today is actually quite projectable to the population. So we've already mentioned Reiwa a couple of times. It's hard to know whether these turning points are real turning points or not. But I think it's fair to say that we felt the dawn of Reiwa last year held the promise of some demographically driven social change and renewal in society. So change in Japan tends to happen when the pressure becomes too hard to resist changing. And this is very much the case with the demographics in Japan. And I've got 4, if you like, megatrends here on this chart, but really they all relate to dealing with a society with dramatically less people of working age. So we're looking at the changing world of work. There has been a labour shortage in Japan, a quite serious labour shortage. Robots are being looked at. Increased numbers, increased participation of women in the workforce, and imported labour are all being kind of thrown at that problem. Of course, with the current crisis, looking at teleworking and different ways of working also plays into the changing world of work. Women power is another one. This is not just about women being more likely to hold down jobs. It's actually about women having economic power. Which is something that before now, certainly women have run household finances on the most part, but have not had their own money. This is going to be a very, very powerful trend that will play out in Japan in years to come. Of course, we all know there are some interesting generational dynamics in Japan. Japan has the most aged population in the world. What's also, I think, particularly interesting is what happens when you have a really small group of younger people, and you know how does that play out, and what's the scarcity value of younger people, and what does that mean? It's very, very interesting questions. And of course, internationalization continues on a pace in Japan. We had the Rugby World Cup which went off brilliantly late last year. Unfortunately, the Olympic Games have been postponed to next year, but we've seen record tourism in the last 5 to 10 years, and really, in some respects, the face of Japan and stance of Japan is becoming more international, and this is a very important trend. So this is a question that we asked last year and this year. The question is, in order for Japan to remain healthy, its working habits and structure need to change. So we have, between 2019 and 2020, we had 59% of people in 2019 agreeing to this. In 2020, we have 68%, which is a significant increase. People increasingly feel that the workplace as it is, the very rigid workplace in Japan, is not really working. This is looking at that same question by gender here, but you can certainly see that females are more likely than males to agree that change has to take place. In terms of women's progress in society, we can see that we saw like almost a 10-point increase on the last question. So we have a 3-point increase in the percentage of people agreeing that women are making progress towards equality in society. So the number is, really low and kind of moving glacially. Interestingly enough, when we look at this by gender, it is males who are more likely than females to feel that progress is being made, I think, which says a lot. In 2019, it was 47% of males versus 32% of females. This year, 44% versus 39%. So that gap's closing, but nevertheless, it would seem that the guys are a little bit not with the program on some of these issues to do with gender equality, and it's an ongoing and very, very interesting area in Japan. Just like in America, the economy has been very strong recently in Japan. We had a 2.4% unemployment rate in January of this year. Who knows where that's headed? It certainly is not going to stay at 2.4%. The reason why the unemployment rate is so low is because the workforce has been shrinking. It's not because Japan it's had a good economy, but the economy, I don't think we would say, has been booming like it has been in the US. This is a consequence of having fewer people of working age. But nevertheless, it's been a fairly positive picture if you are an employee. It's definitely a seller's market. And there has been a strong degree of optimism around the Olympics here. So we had 55% of people, even when we took this survey in mid-March where we were, talking about postponing the Olympics. They hadn't been postponed at that point, but we had 55% of people who were saying they're looking forward to the positive impact that the Olympics will bring to the Japanese economy. But unfortunately, in Japan, disaster always seems like it's around the corner. And in fact, we can say disasters are kind of part of life in Japan. I often say that Japanese kind of tend to expect things to go wrong in some ways. It's kind of like an interesting mindset. But when you think about the level of natural disasters through history that we have in Japan, maybe that helps to explain that. But we had 70% of people in our survey basically agreeing that disaster is part of life in Japan. I'm sure that would be a much lower number if we asked people, is disaster part of life in America? It's a really ingrained mindset there. But if we think about, comparing this crisis to recent crises like the global financial crisis and tsunami in 2011, what's unique about this crisis seems to be the level of personal responsibility and individual decision people need to take to navigate through it. In those other situations, there was not so much people could do. We cut down our power usage in the after the tsunami, so that was at least something. Here, people have to make decisions. Do I go to work? Do I stay at home? Do I go to the shop? Do I stock up on toilet paper? What do I actually really need? What if I can't go out anymore? So these kind of questions, not just in Japan, of course, But this is leading consumption of products and experience to become much more conscious. We really need to think about what we're doing. And as a result, we're likely to see a reordering of needs in many consumer categories as we move out of the crisis. So it simply may not be the case. If you look at, for example, the luxury category, it just may not be thinkable that people, depending on how bad things get, it may not be thinkable people go and spend 200,000 yen, $2,000 on a handbag. Their wellness may be much more important to them than buying those sorts of things, and that'll have some implications for a lot of marketing. But let's look at some direct impacts. This is a snapshot that we took in mid-March of the way that people were responding to the crisis. Now, this is a timeline up to the end of March, because we took this survey during March. But we first started to hear about this whole thing in January, and then during February we had that, if you remember, there was a ship that was docked in Yokohama where the passengers were in quarantine. It was quite controversial. Japanese were beginning to arrive back from Wuhan. The schools were closed at the beginning of March, which was somewhat of a shock. We did our survey in mid-March, and then the Olympics were postponed pretty much the following week or so. Now, last week we had a state of emergency declared in major cities in Japan, not all of them, certainly Tokyo, Osaka, Fukuoka. And it's a little bit, honestly speaking, it's a little bit hard to see what's that different than what was happening before. It seems to be a fairly soft, voluntary kind of lockdown, but nevertheless, you know, it has ramped up a bit. But our situation in terms of cases is way below the US. But again, the level of testing in Japan has been very low, and it's really not my area to comment on that. But I'm sure that our numbers are lower in Japan because there's very little testing going on. So it is in some respects hard to know what the real situation is here. This is a series of areas we asked people about their level of concern. So we looked at the economic downturn, the restrictions on their activities, transportation, job security, availability of daily necessities, the well-being of their family, and food and water safety. Now, what we can see here, at least when we took the survey, the economic downturn was really the key thing. We had 56% of people very concerned about the economic downturn. Probably about twice as many people concerned about the economic downturn than their own job security. May mean that at that point, and I think probably still is the case, that, you know, people perceive there's problems happening in the economy. It's probably happening to someone else. Pity about people who work in restaurants and retail and so forth, but for themselves, it might not have actually hit home yet, but certainly people can see things on the horizon. Interestingly, sort of well-being and family well-being is one of the lower areas. So people are not really that concerned about their personal safety. Sensible precautions are being taken. And the precautions that are being taken are probably viewed as being proportionate to what the situation is. So it's a little bit more about the economy, but at least some impact is being seen by 4 in 5 people. For 20%, 1 in 5, that's a major impact. But at least some impact by 4 in 5 people. Now, I've seen this a few times. I remember in the global financial crisis, I lived in a quite nice neighborhood in Tokyo called Ebisu. There's a lot of bars and restaurants around there. And during the financial crisis, I'm sure it didn't happen overnight, but it seemed like it was overnight. You know, all of these little bars and restaurants started closing their doors. And what's the reason for that is that the Japanese, because they're very cautious, will turn spending off like a tap when there's a problem. This chart here, we looked at a number of different areas and asked people, well, is your expenditure going to increase or decrease? So these numbers are firstly the net loss in the next 1 to 2 months, and then 3 to 6 months a little bit further out. And that number is the percentage of people who say they're going to increase their spending subtracted by the number of people who say they're going to decrease. So we can see, dining out, group activities, theme parks, concerts and shows, cinema are, really taking a hit on this. Fashion goods as well, taxi rides, jewelry, to a lesser extent, household appliances and things like massages and chiropractic and that kind of thing. So these are probably the same categories in the US are probably being hit by this, and it's quite a major hit and could be quite persistent as well. I mean, are you going to, as we come out of this, are people really going to want to sit in cinemas, for extended periods of time? Does the experience that we're going through now change the way that we want to buy things in future? I think that's really one of the most interesting questions on this, but certainly we can see that those impacts are there. Now, this question is asking whether the government is giving you enough confidence to maintain your normal lifestyle and spending habits in most areas. So, of course, it's limited what the government can do, but nevertheless, we have more people disagreeing. About 45-46% disagree that the government is giving them enough confidence to maintain their normal lifestyle and spending habits. So we certainly hope that the government does what it can to mitigate the situation. And there are some announcements that have been made, and certainly hope to see some of that flow through in May. But at the moment, that's what we're looking at. But it's not a bad news story for everybody. Of course, we had to ask about face masks, and you can see that there's an increase in expenditure on face masks that we see moving forward. But online shopping, of course, Amazon and the Rakuten and Yodobashi and these major online companies are in fact very busy. Home delivery services like Dominic Khanna and Uber Eats doing very well. Streaming services, Amazon, Netflix. Also streaming services for educational purposes with the kids at home. Ebooks, video games doing quite well. And supplements, obviously people have a focus on their health, and skincare is not looking too bad through here. So it's not a blanket bad news story. There are some areas where, in fact, expenditure is increasing. And I expect that these results will be fairly similar to what's happening in the southern states too. In terms of perceptions of impact on personal life in the future, we have about 80% of people who are saying there'll be at least some impact on their lives. As we move forward, you can see the impact is decreasing, but then again, the level of uncertainty increases as well. So we go from 80% of people having an impact 1 to 2 months from now to 45% saying a year from now, but 31% cannot predict. So we're looking at a very, very uncertain situation. And uncertainty, of course, is not good for people's spending habits and the economy in general. In terms of the working environment, it's kind of interesting to see in mid-March, at least nearly 70% of full-time workers were seeing their working environment as being business as usual. Even in my own company, there are some people who simply refuse to work from home. Those old habits kind of die hard. It's not so much of a problem because we're thinned out because most people are working from home, but for a lot of people, it's very hard for them to make the change, especially people over the age of 50. So that's kind of that's an ongoing story there on work. Anyway, let's look at, in a more general sense, how consumer confidence is looking compared to previous years. So this is a question that we ask every year, and it says, how do you currently feel about the condition of the Japanese economy? So we go from feeling strongly more positive to strongly less positive. These numbers down the bottom, in a sense, are the percentage of pessimists in our sample, and the number above here is optimists, if you like. So we see every year that the pessimists outweigh the optimists. So we're dealing with a cautious country in many respects here. But we see there's a huge, I mean, the pessimism was higher in 2019 than it was in 2018. This is true, but the optimists kind of held steady, but some people were kind of moving in that negative direction. But we've moved from 45% to 76%. It would be interesting to, and it's what we'd expect, of course, but it would be interesting to see what would happen if we took this measure in 6 months' time instead of the year, to see how that kind of normalizes. So people were going through a shock, but this is their perception of the economy. In terms of my personal financial prospects regarding the wider economy and the role that I play in that, again, we have this big jump, 37 to 50 year on year, about my personal situation. But like I was saying before, my personal situation and the economic situation are a little bit different. So to some extent, what's happening is happening to other people. Of course, not all the time, but it's that kind of sense that, yeah, stuff is happening out there. It might hit me sooner or later, but not quite now. But somewhat encouragingly, I guess we have this question where we ask each year, I feel confident and positive about my future condition in life. And there's really not that much difference between 2019 and 2020 here. So we have, 32% pessimists here, 30% optimists, not really fundamentally different than what it was last year. So I think there is a bit of resiliency that we can see there. This is a question that we ask, how do you see your household expenditure moving in a year, in 1 year's time? Now, when I look at 2019 and I look at 2020, got 33% in 2019 saying a lot more, some more, 33% a lot more, some more in 2020. It's not that different, actually. So I think given the choice, which people may not be given, but given the choice, they would say, well, yep, a year from now, things will be looking pretty normal. And I think that's what people want. And it seems like we have about 6 months where things are obviously going to look a bit shaky, but generally speaking, people perceive that things should be back to normal. And 2 to 5 years, again, is the same. It's really a very similar pattern. You've got 40% of people in 2020 thinking that they will be spending more than spending less. And certainly there are more optimists, almost double the optimists than pessimists here. So I think the basic trajectory of spending is still pretty solid in Japan, at least, if the crisis doesn't keep going and going and going. So how is the US perceived through the crisis? Well, sentiment about America has improved incrementally year on year. We can see, supporters, if you like, these green and grey here, and detractors are the sort of the pink and the red here. We have a lot of people in the middle. Of course, the relationship with the US is not the top of people's list of important things in Japan, but certainly we can see that there are, in 2020, way more people who are positive than are negative, and that has actually moved incrementally positively, which is great to see. Perceptions of Trump are kind of interesting. They've been becoming more positive, or less negative, if you like, year on year. So it's the most positive picture for Trump in 2020 that we've seen during the time that we've been tracking him. Interestingly enough, this is a very interesting point, is that younger people are more positive about Trump than are older people. Younger people are actually in Japan more conservative than you'd expect. It's a very, very interesting dynamic, the way young people think and behave. In terms of perceptions of US brands, we have 35% who are favourable compared to 37% in 2019. There's a bit of an uptick here, and this kind of equivocal part here depends on the brand, but that's relatively speaking pretty stable and certainly more positive than negative. Which are the brands that people perceive as being American brands and that are popular with them? It's brands like, as you'd imagine, Apple and Google, Amazon, Coke, Microsoft, Nike, McDonald's, and also some fashion brands there too, Coach and Ralph Lauren and Tiffany. These are all powerful brands. So you've got those tech brands, food brands, fashion brands there. We ask people every year to what extent they'd like to travel to the US for pleasure. Even though there's been all of this disruption to travel and this sort of loss of perceived safety around travel, we can see that we had a nice uptick between 2018 and 2019 in the percentage of people wanting to travel to the US. And that's held, 61-59 has held quite well, considering the circumstances. And in terms of asking people what are their preferred destinations for international travel, the US has been doing very well year on year compared to other markets, say, for example, Italy here. So that's good. The US is actually doing well as a perceived destination. Somewhat related to the tourism industry, but this is domestic in Japan, is the Integrated Resorts Project. This is a project to build at least 3 large-scale casinos and surrounding resorts in various locations in Japan. There are a lot of American companies out of Vegas that you can imagine would be very interested in this, and we can see that knowledge has increased year on year. The perceptions are not necessarily building in a positive direction for IR, but nevertheless, the agenda is building for that. And what do people see as being the benefits of integrated resorts? It's going to be tax revenue here and economic benefits before it is increasing the level of entertainment. So it seems like if we end up with an impaired economy coming out of this, that for those American operators who wish to launch an integrated resort in Japan, that their agenda will want to be very much more around what are they doing for the community and how is this going to benefit things. Related to integrated resorts, if you like, is this issue of transparency overall, but it's way bigger than integrated resorts. And we can see that every year we've had at least 70% of our sample saying that we need more transparency in our society, including government and business. And 75% this year is the largest number we've seen on that so far. Transparency is a big unmet need in Japan, we could say. Now we have some questions here about climate change. The first question is saying basically 60% of people feel that the Japanese government's response to global climate change is not good enough. 55% of people think businesses should be encouraged by their customers to stop investing in projects that could add momentum to climate change. And 41% of consumers say that they would switch to buying products and services provided by environmentally friendly companies or brands. That result on businesses should be encouraged by their customers is a very interesting result, because usually consumers up till now have been relatively passive on this issue, but they are becoming less passive on the issue of climate change. Japanese know that there are serious issues with energy security and environmental impacts from the way that their system is set up now for energy, and pressure is building for action on that. Nevertheless, Japanese always favour first and foremost a practical approach that balances economic well-being and the environment, and so reasonable solutions guided by the wise men in charge of the government and business are likely to receive cooperation. It's still very much seen as the role of government to make these decisions. Direct action from the people is not really something that is a thing in Japan necessarily yet. But sensible areas of carbon mitigation like natural gas and so forth are, probably going to find a fertile audience in Japan. But definitely, people are well informed about climate change. It's just that the solutioning on it just is a little bit hard for people to see. So I'm going to now talk about some big picture opportunities for US business in the age of Reiwa. I think there are 4 key areas where those megatrends I presented at the beginning of the presentation kind of synergistically manifest. These are not the only areas of opportunity, but I think they're particularly interesting and prominent ones. The first would be the area of convenience and lifestyle. Then experience, wellness, and culture and design. And I'm going to talk about each of these in some detail. So convenience has been a thing. Japan is the land of the convenience store, but that is convenience per se has really been something that's often been designed around the needs of the salaryman. But with women increasing their role in society and work and new lifestyle possibilities emerging, that like convenience is turning into more of a lifestyle enablement thing. But especially for women, as I say, building services around women that need to work is a big opportunity. And things like telework as well that can create flexibility that allow people to do lots of different things, very convenient, and services like that and that support that will do very well. Seniors on for their part, they want bothersome chores taken away from them as they pursue a more meaningful life. So convenience is not just about necessarily being able to do more and be busier. It's about, how can we, how can you kind of like support different lifestyles, possibly more aspirational lifestyles and so forth that are more about, fulfilling oneself than just, working as hard as you possibly can. It's a very interesting area there, and of course a lot of US businesses would have a role in that. It's the area of experience. So the crisis has reinforced that we can do most of our shopping online now, and there's been a big trend to online shopping. So what do we do with all of that extra time that we used to spend shopping? Especially on the weekends, right? So retail concepts that incorporate the opportunity to spend time in an enjoyable, and now we can say, hopefully safe way, are growing, increasing engagements with brands as well as the value of goods sold. So for example, if you're a Toys R Us, which is still in business in Japan, you are going to want to set up play areas where generations, grandma and grandpa can take their child and play with them. It's a place to spend time. Retail becomes experience in that sense. But those needs for experience go well beyond retail into areas like leisure and entertainment. The whole integrated resort project needs to really understand how experience works. Theme parks are always investing in their experience, video games, so on and so forth. And a lot of this experience will be digital as well. So any experiential category with a digital element to it is in fact doing very well in Japan right now, but is going to continue to do very well. In the area of wellness, In the short term, of course, we can expect massive focus on health as a direct result of the crisis. But wellness is a nascent trend in Japan. And, as we play these, increasingly busier roles, and we have all of these digital devices and, stuff that, ultimately makes us work harder and faster. There are some concerns around that and what that's doing to us. And also Japan's seniors, who are, pretty much health obsessed, provide a long-term boost to this wellness area. Then lastly, culture and design. Culture and design, I guess, in a sense, make life worth living in a way. And they intersect to establish interest and status and create content for brands that will truly connect. And American brands are very, very creative. American culture is very, very creative, and continuously has a lot to offer to us in Japan. And we can also say that kind of like outdated assumptions about what is going to connect to typical Japanese are being thrown out the window as well. People here are very, very plugged in to a lot of stuff. And so, the cliches, about what Japanese like are not really necessarily true anymore. And there are great opportunities to meet those needs. So just to summarize, of course, these are not the only areas of opportunity, but especially where you have a business in the US that represents a best practice in your own market, this is likely to be very, very well regarded in Japan. If we look at the world of work, so areas like recruitment tech, it has become extremely hard to hire people in Japan. It's very, very competitive for hiring people. Shared workspaces. There's a WeWork just around the corner from where our office is in Tokyo. Teleworking as well, services and platforms that support that. And of course, management consulting in the area of work is likely to be very, very much needed as the solutions to reforming workplace are actually extremely difficult in this culture because the habits are so ingrained. In women power, of course, premium categories, as women have more of their own money to spend, they are going to want to spend it on things that make them feel good and express themselves. Food, things like better prepared, what we call nakashoku meals that I can just get a lovely meal on the way home. Not a horrible bento, but a very nice gourmet kind of meal from Dean and DeLuca, for example. Those types of businesses are going to do very well. Lifestyle enablement, things that support women with the large number and various responsibilities they have. Experiential businesses. So let's say, to take again the idea of an integrated resort, that women are going to drive a lot of the decisions to visit there, but not just that. Women will really, in a sense, almost dictate the design of a lot of new projects that happen. Management consulting, again, HR consulting. In the area of diversity is becoming a huge topic in Japan right now, but diversity generally relates to the role of women in the workplace so far. In the area of internationalization, tourism is a huge area that's inbound and outbound. So there are many opportunities to redevelop tourism sites in Japan. There are a lot of underused and underappreciated areas in Japan. We haven't really even scratched the surface of what tourism potential exists in this country. But also, Japanese continue to travel. Of course, it's not the same type of mass traveler that it was in the past. It's a more individual traveler, but certainly there's a premium story there too. English training, as you can imagine, and there's still a lot of interest in that sector of English training. and the financial sector as well. People may be in a situation where having zero interest on their money forever is not something that is actually going to excite them that much, and so that there is potential for more sophisticated products in the financial sector. Generational dynamics, of course, premium foods. Older people actually have a higher focus on the quality of what they eat. So it's not necessarily luxury foods as much as it is kind of premium foods. And we've seen in areas like convenience stores, there are higher quality options than there used to be, and this is largely targeted at seniors. But the whole area of fresh food in particular in Japan is very, very has a long way to play out. So if you are in a primary producing industry and you can fly your product in here, there are great opportunities here, and we've worked with American producers, Australian producers, so on and so forth in those areas. And seniors really like that. They've got the time to prepare fresh food too. But of course, your enhanced life support services here, it's not just about nursing care and that sort of thing. There are businesses that really will put everything on one platform. So, fixing up the house, going and doing shopping, driving you wherever you like, as much or as little as you need. Those life support services are getting very popular. But aging tech, of course. So, even going into the area of robotics. Right? So there's but staying in touch, communities that are enabled digitally, all of these sorts of things have a lot of promise in Japan. So to summarize that, in the short term, just like it is everywhere in the world, consumer confidence is taking a big hit. There are winners and losers, and digital entertainment is one area that stands out as a winner, but anything that can be digitally enabled is a winner at the moment. Medium to long term, the consumer outlook that we were able to capture in March at least is cautious but not overly pessimistic. In fact, like if you look at where people perceive their spending will land in a year from now, it's not actually that different than what it was last year. So therefore, it pays attention. It pays to pay attention to the Reiwa Era's long-term trends. Those long-term trends that I was just talking about and opportunities, like they're really still in place there. And transparency and genuine engagement will be a must to maintain trust moving forward. So we're going through, as we saw, there's a structural need for more transparency in Japan, a long-standing need. But as we go through this crisis, and who knows what will unfold from here in this, but there is going to be very much more of a focus on who can I trust, who should I listen to, and no one does business with anyone in Japan unless they trust that person or trust that brand. Trust is absolutely the first point. So I think there's going to be more focus on that. And to cut a long story short, US businesses that solve problems will do especially well. So if you have, and there are going to be a lot of problems, and there are already a lot of problems that come from the age structure of the population here. But if you have a business that can solve a problem, if you can tell a story from a position of trust about solving problems, you will get a very good hearing in this market. So that's pretty much all that I had to present this morning / this evening. So Paul, I'd like to pass it back to you to see if there were any questions. I'm more than happy to answer questions as much as I'm able.
Yes, so thank you very much, Dom. That was a tremendous presentation, and you provided us with just an immense amount of knowledge and information. So just a few questions to kind of begin the discussion. And again, for anyone who's on the call through this webinar, if you have questions, please respond in the chat function, and then Deborah Harlow will be able to see those, and she can queue those up for Don. Start off with, what are your insights on the Japanese public's perception of how its administration has managed COVID-19, and how could this affect consumer confidence? And I'll go ahead and ask all three together, and
Okay.
you can address them in turn. The second is, in the United States, we have seen companies pivot production to address rapidly evolving healthcare needs, such as personal protective equipment, so the face masks, and hand sanitizer. How are Japanese companies responding, and how does this affect their bottom lines? And then lastly, you touched on this some in terms of women at work, but just how could remote work affect women's place in the Japanese workplace? So we've heard about the womenomics policy in Japan. And similarly, how might companies market to that changing female demographic? So we look forward to your answers.
Okay. Well, I think the short answer on the confidence that people are being given by the government, it's very low. I think people are sort of having to sort of work out what they need to do themselves in spite of what the government's saying, to be honest. And we also had that question where that I presented where we saw certainly more people disagree than agree with the idea that the government's giving them enough confidence to keep their spending patterns in place. So I think the government has a big job ahead of it to sort of get people to feel comfortable. Certainly, I think people like Koike-san in Tokyo are doing a good job of communicating with people, and she's even giving presentations in English too, which is excellent. So, but the government really does need to do more. In terms of pivoting production, there are lots and lots of examples. There's a sake maker that's making hand sanitizer now. SoftBank has tied up with a company called BYD in China that massively moved their whole production over to creating face masks, and they can make basically millions of masks now, and they're using that. Sharp is making masks as well, but there's a whole range of local companies that are making efforts to do what's needed to respond to what's going on. I'm sure it's having a terrible impact on their bottom line right now, but of course the goodwill that's built up over time, I think, is going to serve these businesses very well. And people will remember this. And again, people in Japan really look at who you are in order to judge whether they should do business with you. So I think that these things are very important. Your last question on women is a very, very interesting one, because the remote working is something that we're all experimenting with. But remote working is something that suits women especially well. So I think that, there are certain things that are not going to snap quite back to normal. And I think this idea that we all have to be in an office in certain hours, and we all have to wear heels and all of this, well, if you're a woman, we all have to wear heels, is kind of like, that can change. And I think these types of experiences teach us, what is and isn't really necessary. So I think this is really, I think the remote working thing is going to be very positive for women. I certainly hope that it will be. If you've got kids that you need to look after, it's so much easier to do that, even if you're working from home. So next question, if there is one.
This is Deborah. We actually had a question here in the chat. This was from Mika, and Mika asked, do you think there is still an interest by the Japanese in our American culture?
Oh, very much so. Yes. I mean, I think it's we have a more, it's a more balanced perspective. I mean, if we look at, let's say a property like, Disney, for example, there's still a huge amount of interest in Disneyland and in Disney's creative outputs. if we look at Universal Studios, Japan, they're a client of ours. We've done a lot of work with Universal over the years. Their offering has become a little bit more balanced in terms of, what is clearly American and what is more Japanese focused. This year we're opening, Super Nintendo World as well, which is of course a Japanese cultural phenomena around the world. So I think there's more balance in that, but certainly there's a lot of interest still in American culture and American movies and so forth. Just that, Japanese have wide and varied tastes, but still very, very, very much admire the US, especially older people.
Thank you for that. We have another question from the chat from Ron, and he's asking, how do people supplement their income if they are not working?
There are government support programs in place. So if people do pay into unemployment insurance, so that's fairly easy to get if you're cut off. But also companies that have had to furlough their workers and whatever else.
Okay. You're asking about the low?
So yeah, there are government support programs available, and certainly companies. There is talk of companies being subsidised to keep their workers employed.
Okay, thank you. If anyone has any other questions for Dom, feel free to add them to the chat.
Okay, thank you again. So just to clarify, no more questions from the audience? Oh, I think there's one coming in.
Right. Someone's asking about remote working.
Just wait a moment for that, for the rest of the question to come.
Francesca, if you want to add a little more clarity to the chat with your question, that would be wonderful. All right. So the new question is, how do you see that changing the way people will travel internationally, especially for remote working?
I think in the short term, there's going to have to be a big focus on cost cutting in a practical sense. So I think we're getting a very good picture of what travel is and isn't actually necessary. And I think that will have an impact there. So I think there's from what recession we're in now, I think there's going to be an impact from that. But I think you will find people will question the expenditure on travel. So it'll take some time. I'm sure it will get back to normal because people like seeing each other face to face, but generally speaking, if the opportunity presents itself. But I think it'll take some time to get back to normal.
Thank you. Let's see, we have another question that just came in from B. Emerson that says that confidence is low, yet projected spending is more optimistic. Is there a disconnect? Also, are there any ways to effectively measure resiliency?
I think it's a case of short-term, big hit, long-term getting back to normal. I think people expect this thing to last at the most 6 months, and then things are going to come back to normal. That's the sense that we had when we took this survey. And Japanese are well trained actually in how to kind of go through and recover from crises. So, we had the global financial crisis, we've had 3/11. There is recent experience in how things do come back to normal. In terms of measuring resiliency, I think that, given what we do for a living, we'd want to sort of take that measure again, I think probably in 6 months to see if that hypothesis is playing out. But I think people want things to go back to normal. And I think that's kind of half the challenge, but still it's a very uncertain situation.
Thank you. We had an additional question from Francesca about the change in travel. She asks, how do you see that being affected by COVID-19?
Well, I think there's the perception of like it's probably less of an impact than terrorism, I would say, because there are obviously there's going to come a time where it's just like the pandemic has died down. But I think it does kind of like change people's the way that they feel about travel. They're going through experiences, they're questioning. So people question more, and it's not just about travel. People will question more. The consumption decisions, as I mentioned earlier, are becoming more conscious. I'm having to think about what if I take this flight and there's a virus on it. You know, people will come back to normal eventually, but basically, you know, I think there's going to be more consciousness around those decisions.
Thank you. We have a new question that asks, do you think COVID-19 will affect Japan's perceptions of hiring foreign or international talent?
I don't believe that it will. No. I think that that's a long-term, that's a necessity basically. So whatever concerns might be there will be overcome by necessity, and that's not the only concern people would have about hiring international labor.
Thank you. We have a question from Ron, who was asking about the numbers you showed on testing taking place in Japan. He wanted some clarification around the numbers that was being reported of how many had died and how many were tested.
Okay, so I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I think it's about 150 people have died in Japan. I think I saw that the numbers that are being tested are pathetically small. Like they don't reflect the spread of the spread of the virus at all. But nevertheless, the number of deaths in Japan is actually very low. So it's a bit of a I saw there's a famous neuroscientist called Ken Mogi who put a video on YouTube yesterday saying, look, basically this is an enigma. We know that the level of testing in Japan is like disgracefully low, but nevertheless, we're not seeing a situation where emergency rooms are being overwhelmed as well. So, and of course, there are deaths that are not being reported and so on and so forth. But the medical system is by no means in a crisis in Japan yet. So, the numbers are low.
Thank you for that. Ron had as a follow-up question with the number that you said of only 150. He asks why.
Well, it's a little bit out of my area, but there are theories on herd immunity in Japan that have gone through. There's also some serious thought being put into the vaccinations that all Japanese receive when they're kids for tuberculosis, and whether that has had some impact as well. So there are actually studies going on into that as well. So there could be some type of whether there's been an attenuated form of the virus that's come through here, or there is some additional protection coming from the from the basic sort of universal immunization, but nobody really knows. Certainly not me. It's not my area, but that's what people are talking about.
Thank you. Unless we have any last minute questions that anyone would like to add to the chat, those are the questions that one just came in. All right, so this is from Grant asking, the postponement of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics had a major economic impact. Is Japan expecting a significant reduction of attendance and sponsorship of Olympics to be held in 2021?
I'm not sure people are thinking out that far. to be honest, I mean we're hoping that it's going to still be a successful games, but I think we're still reeling from the initial postponement, and I think it's too early to tell.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deborah and Dominic. We'd also like to thank Debbie Howard, who envisioned the program and who has been an invaluable resource on Japanese content, as well again as Deborah Harlow, who has helped immensely in the operations of this program. Since this is the first webinar in Japan America Society of Dallas-Fort Worth history, we welcome your feedback. There will be a brief survey after the program, and we kindly ask that you complete it so that we know how to continually improve. You are also always welcome to write us at info@jasdfw.org. Again, info is info at jasdfw.org. You're welcome to write us if you have comments. Once again, we hope that you have enjoyed the program, and we will send everyone a copy of the presentation via email. We also invite you to attend our next webinar on Friday, April 17th at 11 a.m. Dallas time with the Council on Foreign Relations, Sheila Smith, who will discuss the future of Japanese security. Our last event in April will be on April 29th at 6:30 p.m. Dallas time for a conversation on how COVID-19 has affected higher education in the United States and Japan. These online programs are listed on the slide in front of you, and registration details are available at jasdfw.org. Have a wonderful rest of the evening for those in the United States and a day for those in Japan. Thank you.